Hikers and backpackers. What is the weirdest or creepiest thing you have found while hiking? I was hiking in the Hoh rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington back in '03. I was trying to do this really snazzy hike from the ocean to Mount Olympus. Well, day 1 was a blast, I got everything accomplished. Day 2, fog. Fog as thick as anything you can imagine. I couldn't get a decent GPS fix, so I was pretty much blind, but I knew if I followed the Hoh River upstream, I'd get to one of the campsites I was going for. The day went by, and the fog wasn't clearing up at all. I got to a fairly big clearing and set up my tent. I grabbed a power bar and chilled out as it started to become the darkest black night I've ever experienced. I was seriously a bit unnerved by the whole thing, not scared as much as just anxious. About 2 a.m., I started hearing this huffing noise, like Darth Vader without the helmet on. My imagination started to go freaky, and I reached for my flashlight. I pulled the drawstring on the tent a little, very quietly, and poked my head out. Still dark as death. I heard the noise coming from maybe 5 feet to my right. At this point, I was seriously rethinking my belief in Sasquatch. I poked my flashlight out and turned it on. I was a few feet away from a massive Roosevelt elk, who'd lost his way in the dark as well. He saw the flashlight, bolted the other way, tagged a tree, and knocked himself clean out. I lay in the tent until I heard a groan, a bunch of commotion, and the big guy grunt away. I was camping and hiking in the Okefenokee swamp. My girlfriend and I were far from being the only ones there, but when we woke up one morning, we took a canoe out in the swamp to explore. It was early, and there was a thick layer of fog resting just atop the water. The whole swamp was completely still. No animals in sight at all. We paddled down the waterway for a while and saw nothing else. Not a single person. Not a bird, not anything. We didn't hear a single sound. We had just rounded a bend in the swamp when we heard it. The loudest, guttural bellow I had ever heard in my life. I could feel it echo through my chest. A true dinosaur sound. We stopped paddling and looked at each other, a little creeped out. We knew it was an alligator, but we had never heard one that loud. We both looked behind the canoe, and behind us, the backs and eyes of at least 20 alligators had risen. They had just surfaced out of nowhere. We slowly started to paddle forward and we heard more bellows. They came from all around us. In front, behind, from the sides, sounds emanating from the bush-covered banks. With each glance behind us, we saw more eyes appear, more scaled mounds breaking the water's surface. From the banks in front, we would catch tails sliding into the water. Ripples from these huge reptiles broke the water all around us. We looked back again as we paddled faster. Easily 40 alligators behind us now. And we began to see them appear in front, 10 to 15 huge lizards seemingly blocking our path. Then, one of the largest alligators I have ever seen surfaced right where my paddle was going down. I hit the beast on the back of the head, and the thrash it made was incredible. When its massive head hit the side of the small canoe, I thought we were going in the water. Water came into the canoe as the side dipped down. The beast disappeared below the boat, and we held steady. We paddled forward as fast as we could, right into the dotted landscape of scales and eyes. Behind us, that same guttural roar echoed through my body. As we cut through the field of eyes and backs, we started to see the path clear. The huge monster that had almost capsized us bellowed one last time. We turned as we made it past the last of the animals and we could see the monster staring at us, watching us leave. All the other alligators began to sink below the water. The big guy stayed there watching until he was satisfied we had gone, I guess. Then he disappeared without a sound, back into the black, murky depths of the swamp. We banked the canoe further up the waterway, got out, and just sat around for a while, taking in what had just happened. I went on a 5-day gold panning trip with a couple of buddies of mine. We drove 6 hours down and used logging roads. We're talking totally overgrown roads where we had to remove trees just to pass. We didn't see a single human the entire time we were out there, except for on the third night, at 3 a.m. We were sitting around the fire, drinking some beers, swatting at bugs, and just talking, when I heard something. I looked over and noticed some light in the trees. What the heck? It was a truck, driving up the logging road we had cleared ourselves to get there, at 3 a.m. The truck got up to where we were, pulled into where we had made camp, a small turnoff spot for logging trucks, and sat there for 10 seconds while we all kind of stared in shock at one another. I got up and started walking towards the truck to say hello and ask what the heck they were doing out at 3 a.m. on abandoned logging roads when the truck just backed up, turned around, and drove off the way it came. The guy, or guys, had just driven 6 hours down logging roads all through the night, saw us, and left without saying a word. We were all sitting there going, what the heck? We all figured the guy was going to come back to kill us in our sleep. The next morning, we headed down the road and saw nothing. They hadn't set up camp or anything. They just left. We figured we were likely camped out near a grow-op for one of the gangs, Hell's Angels, most likely, and they were coming out to check who had come out to their spot, or they were there to pick the crop in the middle of the night. One time, driving down a bunch of logging roads at night, around 4 a.m., looking for a campsite we had driven past, we took a wrong turn and drove right into a drug operation cashing out their crop. We turned a corner and bam, floodlights and like 15 guys all staring at us in the middle of the forest down some logging roads. We just sort of turned around and got the heck out of there. My hometown is a tiny little place called Kanab, Utah. If you've been to Zion National Park, Bryce Canyon, or the Grand Staircase, you've been close to it. Anyway, the hills right around Kanab are full of all kinds of hidden gems. Tons of ruins and relics from Native Americans, dinosaur tracks, slot canyons, etc. One of my favorite hikes, though, is a place called Trail Canyon. It's only accessible by hiking. The canyon forks many times, and it seems each fork has a different treasure. Here are some things I've found. A cave perfectly hidden by a tree, with some old carvings from somebody who hid out there in the 1800s. More than one temporary shelter. One was a natural shelter created by two boulders leaning against each other, and inside was a half-decomposed sleeping bag, cans, and other paraphernalia from the 1970s. Somebody lived there for a while, then never came back. A cabin built at 1/3 normal proportions. It turned out to be the home of a couple of brothers who were little people in the early 1900s. Being different meant they probably didn't get treated well, so they built their own place how they liked it and stayed there. They'd ride their horses into town, get drunk, and shoot their guns, then ride back up to their cabin by the spring. Today, there's still a pair of overalls on the table, so you can get an idea of their size. I know I took a bunch of pictures of this, but I can't find them. I'll keep looking. Just beyond the cabin is a cave where cattle rustlers used to hide out. There's still an old bucket and a frying pan, and the walls are scored with markings indicating the sizes and locations of herds. If you're ever in the neighborhood, stop by the Bureau of Land Management office and ask for a good hike to go on. There are dozens. I work in the outdoor field and lead trips regularly. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Stringer in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position I was in, I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I lay there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I could really only see his outline. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes but may have only been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree, facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then, he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. This happened to me back in the 80s, when I was in my 20s. On occasion, I would go car camping with my yellow tiger cat, Oberon. He had an overbite, drooled, had a monster purr, and was awesome in every way. He loved riding in the car. My solo camping was stupid, and I can't recommend it, but I needed the aloneness and I needed the bravery. I would drive up roads, some Bureau of Land Management, some National Forest, some disused logging roads. I wouldn't go too far, just find a spot that appealed to me, pull off the road as far as I could, set up a small camp, and stay for a night or two, just reading, bird watching, painting, being with my cat, just spending time being me. One day, I went up a road and found a pretty meadow with a small stream curving around through the trees, a perfect place. The cat and I walked around a bit, checking it out. At the side of the meadow near the road was a large, flat, round rock. A perfect table. I always packed good food, and I liked a bit of elegance. I set out a placemat, a cloth napkin, an unopened bottle of dark beer, my sandwich still wrapped in foil on my plate, cookies, and a bowl of kibble for Oberon. He had wandered a bit, so I went to get him. We went into the trees and wandered around for a bit. It was a very lovely day, warm, sunny, with a light breeze, and the whole area was beautiful. We weren't out of sight of my car and the rock for very long, maybe 15 minutes. I picked up the cat and walked back, looking forward to lunch. When we got to the rock, it was gone, eaten. The foil was crumpled into a ball, the beer was empty with the opener next to the bottle, the cookies gone, the sandwich gone, the napkin folded loosely, and the knife laid across the plate. It was a real, oh crap, feeling. I ran for the car, tossed Oberon in, started the car, turned around, and headed back down the hill. Then I thought, what if whoever ate my food was hiding in my back seat? I stopped, heart pounding, checked the back, all okay, and headed back to town and my friends, who were understandably freaked out by my story. I still camped after that, but it took a while for my courage to return. Month-long canoe trip in northern Ontario. A group of us, 8, were canoeing south from our kickoff. About 2 weeks in, hundreds of kilometers from access roads, we were using portages that hadn't been maintained and maps that were outdated by a decade or so. As we paddled around a corner in the shallow lake, we saw a giant crucifix on the shore, the white paint peeling from it. Slightly freaked out, we continued on until we encountered a small town and church on the shore about a kilometer further down. It was midday, so we decided to have lunch and tour the area. The church was in remarkably good shape despite the piles of bat guano. After touring the area, we discovered a boarded-up mine shaft with rails going underground. The houses in the town had fallen into disrepair, with the second floors collapsed into the main floor, and the main floor into the cellar. One cellar contained deer carcasses and bones. Based on the items we found in the area, really old cola cans, tobacco tins, we figured the town was deserted in the 50s or 60s. There was no road access that we could find for kilometers around. We decided to put as much distance between the town and us before setting up camp. I was leading a group of fairly beginner backpackers in the backcountry above Nevada Fall in Yosemite. On our first day in, we'd gotten a before sunrise start up the trail. As we climbed the steps up to Nevada Fall, I saw a tent in a very strange alcove at one of the turns, overlooking the falls. You're supposed to camp 200 feet from any water source, and this was literally 2 feet from the trail, so it was pretty strange. I figured I'd mention it to the ranger once we got up to Little Yosemite Valley, but they happened to be out when we came through the camp, so we were halfway through Little Yosemite Valley before most people had broken camp. Winding our way through the approach that takes us to the other side of the Merced River, a guy came up to our group from behind, and he was making a good pace. But he had a bottle of Aquafina in his hand, a bedroll over his shoulder, and nothing else. Tennis shoes, jeans, very out of place. I took a look, and there was bark and little bits in the water, so I told him about Giardia and that he really shouldn't drink river water unless it's filtered. I got a strange sort of mumbled half-answer from him. He trudged on, and I was watching him as he was going, looking left and right, but not at the scenery. Then a few minutes later, a chopper came roaring up the valley, and my group stopped to gawk. That's when I noticed Giardia boy was pressed up against a tree trunk ahead of us. I gathered my group to look at some interesting outcropping I made up on the spur of the moment and watched the sketchy guy slinking from tree to tree for cover. There was no real clearing to even indicate anything to the Park Service, but I held back my group just the same for some distance. 5 minutes later, the ranger from Little Yosemite Valley came sprinting up the trail. I just pointed and said, "He's 200 yards ahead, probably under a tree." The ranger huffed, "Thanks," and moments later had the guy in zip ties. I never found out all the behind-the-scenes details, but passing through and catching the same ranger several days later upon our return, we found out that camping near water was the least of his problems. The words bank robbery, stolen weapon, and heroin were mentioned. Well, there goes the valley. This past winter, I hiked one of the high peaks in the Adirondacks with a buddy of mine and camped out overnight. Everything was fine the entire first day we were there. I had a great night's sleep and woke up early to hike back to the parking area. On the way back down the trail, my friend and I noticed that someone else had been hiking as well. About a mile into the walk, I stopped and saw that my full name, first and last, was drawn into the snow on the side of the footpath. I didn't do it, and neither did my friend. It had been snowing a bit throughout the night, and if it had been drawn the day before, the snow would have covered it up. We got a bit freaked out and decided to hustle back to our car so we could get the heck out of there. We finally got back to the parking area, and I went to sign myself out of the registry book. When I turned the page to where I had signed in, I saw that someone had scribbled out all of my information to the point where you couldn't read it anymore. No one else had signed into the book besides me for 3 days. I will not be going back there. I went to a summer camp when I was younger, and every summer at the camp, there was a 4-day-long camping trip in the nearby national park. I decided to go on it, and on our first day, we canoed for almost 7 hours into what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. It was a couple of hours before dark when we decided to make camp, so we pulled into a tiny bay and disembarked. One of the other kids in our group, there were about 10 of us campers and 4 counselors, immediately decided to head into the woods to collect some firewood, while the rest of us set up the site. Not 2 minutes later, he came sprinting back, shouting about how he found people in the woods in huts and teepees. I remember laughing along with everyone else. He was a sort of goofy guy, so we thought he was full of it, until we noticed how serious he still was. So most of us decided to investigate. We slowly made our way through the dense forest, and less than 200 feet from our campsite was a clearing with people milling about. Set up in the clearing were actual teepees, along with a few huts made of branches. At the back of the clearing was a bunch of pickup trucks, and behind them was a dirt track leading away. And not 15 feet in front of us as we emerged from the woods was a huge table with probably 40 people sitting at it. They stopped and stared at us, and we stared back. Then, a small, older woman with a feather in her hair stood up. She smiled and offered us some food. Our head counselor politely declined, then asked if it was okay if we were camping nearby. She said it wouldn't be a problem, and the other people were already getting back to their huge meal. She sat back down and we turned and headed back to the shore of the lake. We were all pretty stunned that we were going to be staying the night a few steps away from a lot of random strangers in the woods, but the counselors said it would be fine and finished setting up the camp. We all turned in pretty early though. Now that I'm even older than those counselors were, I don't think I would have had the guts to stay there through the night. The next morning, we got up really early and were getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a voice called out from the woods. The old woman from the table stepped out and asked if any of us had seen her husband. Now, none of us knew who her husband was or what he looked like, and considering we had interacted with these people for less than a minute, it was pretty weird of her to come over to ask about him. Also, and I swear this is the total truth, she was holding a huge knife. I remember we were all very still, and one of the counselors said we hadn't seen him. She turned and left, and we hauled ourselves out of there. It wasn't until we got to the next lake that the counselor in my canoe relaxed and acknowledged how messed up that had been. As if that wasn't enough, on the last night of the trip, I woke up in the middle of the pitch-black night and stepped out of the tent all 10 of us kids shared to go relieve myself. When I was younger I woke up a lot to do my business, but it was the first time on this particular trip. As I started doing my business, I heard rustling and noises, and then a short howl. We were camped on one side of a very narrow inlet that extended far back from the main lake, and in the darkness on the other side of that inlet, I could see glowing eyes. I have almost never been more scared, but I bravely finished my business and slowly, yes, slowly, went back into my tent. I am not religious at all, but that was the one and only time in my life where I legitimately prayed that those wolves didn't come over the water or around to us. Here are a few backpacking stories. The first one isn't as crazy as some of the others, but it was pretty alarming at the time. My dad and I were backpacking in the Wind River Range, WI, and stopped at a bridge to wait for the other guy in our group to catch up. We hadn't seen any other person in 3 days and were at least a 2-day hike from the trailhead parking lot, which is small and 30 miles by gravel road from the nearest town of 2,000 people. So it's relatively remote. We were sitting around chatting and skipping rocks on the river when movement caught my eye in the bush maybe 100 feet away. I looked closer and it was a guy's face, the guy obviously crouched and staring at us while trying to remain still. I subtly pointed him out to my dad. We were both concerned but decided to just wait for our friend, hoping this guy would leave. He didn't. After maybe 10 minutes, we decided we should advance on the trail that goes nearer to where he was, although he was still a good 50 feet off the trail. The anxiety was killing us knowing this dude was just crouched there staring at us. So we took out our ice axes and held them at our sides, then started walking. As we got closer, the guy got up and started approaching us. Max anxiety level now, of course. As he got even closer, we realized he was like 18. He goes, "Sorry guys, I was trying to scare my friends and confused you for them," and left the area. No gear or anything. Alright, I can believe his story, but it was weird we didn't see anyone else, and it must have been obvious that we saw him, so why didn't he stop lurking before we had to approach? Possibly he was afraid of us when he realized we weren't from his group. After he left, we stayed in the area waiting for our friend and didn't see anyone else for another day. Another weird one, also at the Winds. We saw a rough-looking guy with an epic beard and raggedy clothes leading a group of 15 goats from far away. He was fishing with just a hook and line, and the goats followed him everywhere he went. We crossed paths with him later and he said he had been backpacking for 2 weeks. It seemed unlikely given his appearance and large group of goats. We figured he was living in the backcountry. He was a nice guy, though. A kid-sized Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles backpack and sleeping bag. They looked like they had been there for several months at least. The bag was full of thousands of packs of matches and a deed to a house in Washington state. This happened in Maryland. Oh, I forgot about a much better story. I was hiking in Southern Virginia and came to a shelter. At this point, it was about an hour until sundown, and 2 other hikers had already set up camp and gotten a fire going. So, I decided to sling my tent up and make some dinner. I never sleep in those funky shelters. Anyway, at some point, I noticed that there was a guy in the far back corner of this shelter. It looked like he was sitting facing the wall, but it was hard to tell with him being in the shadow of the corner. I didn't think much of it. I was hungry. So I was sitting there munching on my crappy rehydrated dinner as the sun was going down. As my eyes began to adjust to the darkness, I glanced over towards the shelter and suddenly realized that I could see the whites of the person's eyes. This dude had smeared soot from the fire pit all over his face and body and had been sitting in the shadows watching the other hikers and myself the entire time. I tried to stealthily let the other hikers know what was up and get the heck out of there. I walked a few miles further down the trail, and then cut to the side and hiked about a mile off the trail before I felt comfortable setting up camp. This happened back in the mid-80s. My friends and I, for in all, used to go hiking in the Cascades in Oregon quite a bit. While 99% of the hikers stick to the trails, we'd plan trips off the beaten path to discover areas few people had ever seen. We'd plan a trip, take a trail up to the general area, and then strike out towards a place we wanted to check out, sometimes a day or 2 out depending on how rough the terrain was. Our last trip started out normally enough. We'd made it to our launch point, spent the night, had breakfast the following day, and had broken out our Forest Service topographical maps to make our plans. This time around, we hadn't decided on a destination and were considering our options. That's the last thing we remember for nearly 24 hours. We woke up the next day, still in our clothes from the previous day, in our tents. We didn't even know a day had passed until one of my friends checked his watch and noticed that the date wasn't right, which I confirmed with my own watch. Yes, even back then there were watches that kept the date. One moment we were looking over maps to see where we wanted to go, and the next we woke up in our tents, all of us feeling like we were hungover. The thing is, while my friends swore they didn't remember anything, I did, if only a little. What I remember is that we were doing some hard hiking in the mountains when we heard children's voices, the sort of noise you hear at a playground. All of us were wondering what was going on, thinking that we'd really screwed up our navigational skills in a way that boggled the mind, and we headed towards the noise to see just how we'd gotten so far off track and where on God's green earth we actually were. We broke out of the tree line into a clear area, where there were a number of low, squat buildings, the sort that remind you of what the U.S. Army builds. Spare, utilitarian, ugly, green. Surrounding the buildings was a heavy-duty chain-link fence, not the normal sort but the industrial-strength kind. Towards where we were was a large blacktop, where children were running around, and where a mixed group of kids and adults was also playing a game of basketball. It was, indeed, a playground of sorts, inside of what looked like a military compound. Out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the mountains, and not on any map. I remember one of the adults looking up, then everything gradually falling silent as the entire group of adults and kids eventually noticed the 4 dumbstruck hikers on the other side of the fence. And then nothing. That's it until I woke up in one of our 2 tents the next day. As I said, my friends said they remembered nothing, and all they wanted to do after they realized they'd lost a day was get the heck out of the mountains and back home. Me, I remembered, at least a little, and I was ticked off because I figured we had stumbled onto something secret and had been drugged and dumped back at our campsite for our efforts. I wanted to figure out where we'd been hiking, go back, and see what there was to see, but the guys were having none of it. I tried a number of times to see if I could get any of the gang to go back up with me, this time with cameras, and try to figure out where we'd decided to hike, but the guys flat out refused any discussion of the matter, much less an actual attempt. Going by yourself into wild country is outright stupid, and I wasn't quite so ticked off as to consider this a valid option, so I never went on my own. To this day, I have no idea what it is that we found or why someone thought it necessary to drug us and dump us. I figured we weren't killed outright because 4 missing, experienced hikers would result in a newsworthy search and rescue operation.